I hid the fact that I sold my late wife's family farm for $11 million, and I never said a word to my son until 3 weeks after his wedding. When his new wife walked into my kitchen, carrying a folder from a lawyer she said I needed to sign. Thank God I stayed quiet, because that folder wasn't about anything I could have imagined. And by the time she set it on my table, I already knew exactly what she was trying to do. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 63 years old, and I live outside Lansing, Michigan, in a house I built with my own two hands back when lumber was cheap, and my back didn't ache every morning. For 31 years, I worked as a machinist at a parts plant off Route 27, punched a clock, packed a lunch, came home smelling like metal shavings. Nobody at the diner on Saturdays had any reason to think twice about me. That's exactly how I wanted it to stay. If you're joining me for the first time, I'm glad you're here, son or daughter, whichever you are to me tonight. Stick around, because this story doesn't end where you think it will. My wife Carol passed 6 years ago, breast cancer, and losing her took something out of me I never quite got back. Her family had owned a stretch of farmland out near Ionia for 4 generations, nearly 200 acres of it, though by the time it came to us, most of it was leased out to a neighboring operation and hadn't turned a real profit in years. It was just land. Quiet, flat, full of memories of Carol, as a girl running through the rows with her sisters. I never had any plan to sell it. It felt like the last living piece of her I had left. Our son Daniel was 26 when his mother died, and grief hit him different than it hit me. He got quieter, threw himself into work, started dating a woman named Ashley about a year later. Ashley was polite enough at first, always complimenting my woodworking or asking about Carol like she genuinely wanted to know her, which I appreciated more than I let on. But there was a way Ashley looked around my house sometimes, cataloging things that I noticed and then talked myself out of noticing. Grief makes you suspicious of your own instincts. I told myself I was imagining it. Then, 2 winters ago, a development company out of Grand Rapids came knocking. They wanted the Ionia land for a distribution warehouse project, offered a number so far beyond what farmland usually goes for that I actually laughed out loud when their lawyer said it over the phone. $11,200,000 after the broker's cut. I didn't sleep for 2 nights straight after that call. Carol would have hated the idea of trucks and concrete where her family used to grow corn, but I also knew she'd have wanted Daniel taken care of. And the land wasn't doing anybody any good sitting there, half-leased and quietly rotting into legal complications every time a cousin died and left behind another slice of ownership to untangle. I signed the papers in February, quietly, working with a lawyer 2 towns over that nobody in my life knew. I told myself I'd figure out the right way to tell Daniel eventually. I told myself there was no rush. What I didn't tell myself, not out loud anyway, was the real reason I was waiting. I wanted to see who my son was marrying before that kind of money became part of the conversation. Some part of me already knew I needed to watch a little longer before I opened my mouth about it. Daniel and Ashley got engaged that spring, only about 6 weeks after the sale closed, though, of course, nobody but my lawyer and I knew that timing. Ashley started coming around more, always sweet, always helpful, insisting on doing dishes after Sunday dinner, asking me questions about retirement that felt just a little too specific for someone her age to be curious about. She asked once, very casually while drying a pot, whether the Ionia land was still in the family or whether I'd ever thought about doing something with it. I told her it was still sitting there, same as always, which at that point had already stopped being true. She nodded and let it go. But I noticed she brought it up again a month later in a slightly different way, wrapped inside a question about whether I'd made a will. Wedding planning that summer turned into its own kind of storm. Ashley wanted a venue out near Traverse City, right on the water, the kind of place where the deposit alone could buy a used car. Daniel kept telling me not to worry about it, that they'd figure out financing somehow, maybe a loan. And every time he said that, something in me tightened, because I had $11 million sitting in an account, and my son was out here pricing loan interest rates for flowers and a dance floor. I ended up quietly covering almost the entire wedding myself, wiring money straight to the venue and the caterer, telling Daniel it came from Carol's old life insurance and some savings I'd built up over the years. That much wasn't a complete lie. It just wasn't the whole truth either. Ashley, for her part, seemed very interested in exactly how those payments were arriving. She asked Daniel more than once whether his dad had come into some money recently, said with a laugh, like it was nothing, but I caught her watching my face carefully whenever the subject came up at dinner. Daniel brushed it off every time, telling her his father was just a careful saver who'd been putting money away his whole life for this exact day. I let him believe that, because correcting it meant opening a door I still wasn't ready to walk through. Looking back now, I can see how deliberately she built toward it, question by question, always sounding harmless, always timed to feel like nothing. At the time, I told myself I was being an overly cautious old man, suspicious of a young woman simply because that's what widowed fathers do. I was wrong about that, and I'd find out exactly how wrong before the year was out. The wedding itself, I have to say, was lovely. Ashley looked radiant, and for a few hours that August afternoon out by the water, I let myself just be a proud father, instead of a man quietly carrying a secret worth more than the whole town of Ionia put together. String lights, a string quartet, everybody laughing and dancing. Ashley's mother, a woman named Renee, with a talent for delivering insults wrapped in compliments, cornered me by the bar at one point and said, out of nowhere, "It's such a comfort knowing Daniel's got a father who can help set them up properly." I smiled and said something forgettable back, but I remember exactly how she studied my face after she said it, like she was checking for a reaction she already expected to find. During the toast, Daniel's best man made a joke about Ashley marrying up, and half the room laughed, but Ashley's smile at that moment had an edge to it. I didn't like, something calculating underneath the joy. I danced with my son. I hugged him tight and told him I loved him, and that his mother would have been so proud of the man he'd become. Every word of that was true. But driving home alone that night, I knew something was coming, even if I couldn't say exactly what yet. The honeymoon was 10 days in Hawaii, which I quietly paid for as a wedding gift, dressed up again as savings I'd supposedly set aside for years. When they got back, something shifted. Ashley started calling me directly, not through Daniel, which she'd never really done before. She'd ask if I wanted company for dinner, offer to help me organize my files, or simplify my banking since I was getting older and shouldn't have to manage so much on my own. She said all of this warmly, like she was asking about my garden. But I'd spent 3 decades on a factory floor, learning to read people, trying to get something out of you before they actually asked for it. And Ashley was doing the exact same dance, just with a nicer perfume. One Saturday, she showed up at my door alone, no Daniel, carrying a casserole dish I never asked for, and steered the conversation no less than 3 times toward protecting what I'd worked so hard for as I got older. I nodded along and gave her nothing. But that night, sitting at my kitchen table, I admitted something to myself I'd been avoiding for weeks. My daughter-in-law knew, or at least suspected, and she was circling closer every week. I needed to understand exactly what Ashley knew and how she'd found any of it out, so I called an old buddy of mine from the plant, Ray Delgado, who'd retired early and did small background check work on the side for local businesses, mostly checking up on contractors and new hires. I laid the whole thing out for him over coffee at the diner. Carol's land, the sale, the 11 million, Ashley's questions creeping in earlier and closer together every month. Ray didn't look surprised at all. He told me property sales in Michigan get recorded at the county register of deeds, meaning anybody patient enough with an internet connection could search the transfer records and see exactly what that Ionia parcel sold for and who the check went to. It took him maybe 20 minutes at his own kitchen table to pull the filing up himself, just to prove how easy it really was. Then he asked me something that made my coffee go cold in my hand. He asked exactly when Daniel had proposed to Ashley. I told him, and Ray pulled up the recording date on the land sale, February 14th. Daniel proposed the first week of April. Ray looked at me across that diner table and said quietly, "Walter, you might want to ask yourself if this was ever really about your son." I didn't want to believe him. I told myself plenty of young men propose in springtime, that I was building a conspiracy out of coincidence and a few too many casserole visits. But some part of me, the part that had been quietly watching for months, already suspected Ray was right. I needed proof before I said a word to anybody. Ray offered to dig further, and I told him to go ahead before I'd even finished thinking it through, because at that point I needed the truth more than I needed my own comfort. It took him about 10 days. What he found wasn't just uncomfortable. It was close to a pattern out of a textbook. Ashley had been engaged once before, 3 years earlier, to a man whose family owned a chain of auto dealerships across 2 counties. That engagement ended abruptly, 7 months in, right around the time the family business went through a restructuring that cut off most of the money the son was expecting to inherit. No public fight, no drama, just a quiet split that Ashley's old college roommate described to Ray as her losing interest fast, the moment the money situation changed. Ray also found something in Ashley's work history. She'd held 3 different jobs in 5 years, each one at a small financial planning office, and each one ending not long after she'd built close relationships with older, wealthier clients and tried to get herself listed on account paperwork she had no real business being near. One employer had let her go quietly after she was found requesting power of attorney forms for a client's elderly father without anyone's authorization. Nothing criminal exactly, nothing that would hold up cleanly in court, but all of it painting the same picture, over and over. A woman who found opportunity in other people's money and moved fast the moment she sensed it was real. I sat with that file in my garage for a long time that night, the same garage where Carol used to bring me coffee while I worked. And I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with my son's future. I wasn't angry yet. I was getting ready. I decided not to say anything to Daniel right away, because I needed to see exactly how far Ashley was willing to take this, and because some stubborn part of me still hoped I was wrong about her. I didn't have to wait long. About 3 weeks after they got back from Hawaii, Ashley called and said she wanted to stop by with something important, just paperwork, nothing to worry about. She said in that same easy tone she used for everything. I told her Saturday morning would work fine. When Saturday came, she pulled into my driveway with a folder tucked under her arm, and a man I didn't recognize walking beside her, introduced simply as Kevin, a notary who worked with the financial office where she used to be employed. My stomach dropped the second I saw his lanyard. Ashley sat down at my kitchen table, the very same one where Carol and I used to eat breakfast every morning for 30 years, and slid the folder toward me with a smile that didn't quite make it to her eyes. She explained it as a family protection plan, something her old colleague had put together, a document that would add her as a secondary authorized contact on certain accounts in case anything ever happened to me, framed entirely around love and caution and looking out for an aging father-in-law living alone. She even brought up Carol's illness as an example, said it so gently, like she was genuinely worried, like the whole thing had been born out of concern for me. Kevin, the notary, sat quietly at the end of the table with his stamp and his folder, waiting for a signature that would have handed my daughter-in-law a legal reach into money she wasn't even supposed to know existed yet. I looked at that folder for a long moment, and then I looked up at Ashley and asked her, calmly, if she wanted to know how I'd found out about the auto dealership family. Her face changed instantly, the warmth cracking right off her in real time. She asked what I was talking about, but her voice had lost that easy, practiced smoothness. I told her plainly, no yelling, no theatrics, just facts laid out one after another, the way I used to walk a new hire through a machine at the plant. I told her about the property records, about the timeline between the land sale and Daniel's proposal, about the engagement that ended the moment the dealership money dried up, about the job she'd been let go from over unauthorized paperwork. I told her I knew about her questions over dishwater, her offers to simplify my banking, every breadcrumb she thought she'd scattered so carefully over the past several months. Kevin sat frozen at the end of the table, clearly realizing this wasn't the routine signing he'd been called in for. Ashley tried to recover, said I was misreading everything, that this was purely about family security, that any responsible daughter-in-law thinks ahead. I let her talk for almost a full minute without interrupting, because I wanted her to hear exactly how thin it sounded once it was actually spoken out loud, instead of dressed up in a soft, caring voice over a casserole dish. When she finally stopped, I slid the folder back across the table, closed, unsigned, and told her I wasn't signing anything that day, or any day after it. Then I told her something else I'd been holding on to for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I told her Daniel was going to hear every single word of this from me before the week was out. Kevin gathered his folder and his stamp and left almost immediately, wanting no part of whatever this had become. Ashley stayed a few minutes longer, swinging between anger and a kind of desperate backpedaling, telling me I was going to destroy her marriage over assumptions, that Daniel would never believe any of it coming from me because it would sound like a jealous, controlling father trying to run his son's life. That part actually worried me a little, because she wasn't entirely wrong about how it might look on the surface. A father with a secret fortune suddenly accusing his new daughter-in-law, right after refusing to sign over any control. So instead of just giving Daniel my version of events, I decided to show him the actual proof, the property records, Ray's research, and something I hadn't mentioned to Ashley yet, a recording. I'd started recording quietly on my phone the moment Kevin walked through my door, tucked into my shirt pocket, because some instinct told me I'd need more than just my word. I called Daniel that same afternoon and asked him to come by without Ashley. Told him it was important, told him I loved him, and that this wasn't easy for me either. He showed up 2 hours later looking pale, asking right away if I was sick, if something was wrong with my health. I told him no, that this was about something else entirely, something I should have told him months ago. I sat him down at that kitchen table, made him a cup of coffee the way he'd taken it since he was a teenager, and told him everything, starting with the phone call from the development company and ending with the notary who'd been sitting in that exact chair 3 hours earlier. Daniel sat completely still while I talked, his coffee going cold in front of him, untouched. I told him about the 11 million first, watched his face move through shock, and then something close to hurt, asking quietly why I hadn't told him sooner. I explained honestly that I'd been scared of exactly what had ended up happening, that money changes how people look at you, and I hadn't wanted it changing how anyone looked at his wedding either. He nodded slowly, absorbing that, and I could see he understood it even through the sting. Then I moved to Ashley, and that's when his whole posture shifted. I laid the timeline in front of him, the land sale date next to the proposal date, side by side. I told him about the dealership family, about the job she'd lost over unauthorized paperwork. I played him a short piece of the recording, just enough for him to hear her voice explaining the family protection plan to a notary she'd brought without asking me first. Daniel didn't say anything for almost a full minute, just staring at the folder still sitting closed on my counter. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier than I expected. He said, "She asked me twice last month if you'd ever mentioned changing your will. I hadn't known that detail." It confirmed everything Ray had already found, laid out fresh and painful from his own memory. He thanked me quietly for telling him, then asked for the folder, the recording, and Ray's full report, and said he needed to go home and talk to his wife himself, tonight, alone. I didn't hear from him for 2 days, and those were two of the longest days I'd had since Carol's funeral. When he finally called, his voice sounded worn but clear, the voice of a man who'd already made a decision and just needed to say it out loud to make it real. He told me the conversation with Ashley had gone about as badly as I'd expected. She denied everything at first, then pivoted to blaming me, calling me controlling for hiding the land sale in the first place, twisting the whole situation so her own behavior looked like a reasonable reaction to my secrecy. Daniel told her plainly that hiding an inheritance from your own son and secretly researching your father-in-law's net worth before your wedding weren't the same thing, and she didn't have a good answer for that. He also told me her mother, Renee, had called him directly, insisting he was overreacting, that every family looks out for its future, which only confirmed for Daniel that Renee had likely known exactly what her daughter was doing from the start. By the end of that call, Daniel told Ashley he needed space, packed a bag, and drove to his old college roommate's apartment instead of going home that night. He told me he wasn't making any permanent decisions out of anger, that he wanted a clear head first, but that something had broken that he didn't think could be repaired, not after seeing that folder. Not after hearing her own voice on the recording explaining herself to a notary like it was the most normal request in the world. I told him I was proud of him for handling it with a clear head instead of rage. He said something back that stuck with me for a long time. "You protected me before I even knew I needed protecting." 6 weeks later, Daniel filed for an annulment, his lawyer explaining that, given how quickly things had unraveled and the clear evidence of what Ashley was after before the marriage even happened, it was a far cleaner path than a drawn-out divorce. Ashley didn't fight it much once she realized the recording and Ray's report existed as documented proof, understanding that dragging things out publicly would only make her look worse. Renee called Daniel a handful more times, trying to smooth things over on her daughter's behalf, but he'd stopped answering by then, telling me he'd already said everything he needed to say. I finally sat down properly with my son a few weeks after that. No folders, no recordings, just the two of us at my kitchen table on a quiet Sunday afternoon, and I told him the rest of it, the parts I'd skipped past in the rush of that first hard conversation. I told him about his mother, about how much she'd loved that land, about how selling it had felt like losing another piece of her all over again. I told him the 11 million sat there almost like something Carol had left behind without ever meaning to, a strange inheritance from a woman who never got the chance to see her grandchildren grow up. I told him I wanted to set some of it aside for him properly, with a lawyer, paperwork done right, not hidden, not rushed, and definitely not connected to anyone who hadn't earned his trust yet. He cried a little at that, not out of sadness this time, but something closer to relief. He told me he didn't care nearly as much about the money as he cared about the fact that I'd been quietly protecting him the whole time, even when he had no idea there was anything to protect him from. It's been almost a year now since that Saturday morning Ashley walked into my kitchen with a notary trailing behind her like she already owned the place. Daniel is doing well, staying with me for a while as he gets back on his feet, talking about going back to finish the business degree he set aside years ago. We talk most nights now, real conversations, not the careful, surface level kind we used to have back when I was carrying a secret without even realizing how much that secret was quietly protecting him. I still think about Carol most days, about that land, about the strange way her money ended up doing something I never intended, exposing a woman who would have taken advantage of our son if I hadn't stayed quiet long enough to see her clearly first. People sometimes ask me if I regret not telling Daniel about the sale before the wedding, and the honest answer is no, not for one single second. If I'd told him, if I'd told anyone, Ashley would have gotten exactly what she wanted from the very beginning, and I never would have seen who she really was until it was far too late to do anything about it. Staying quiet was never about hiding money from my own son. It was about giving the truth enough room to show itself on its own, without me forcing it, without anyone having a reason to perform a kindness they didn't actually feel. Thank God I didn't say anything, because that silence gave me exactly what I needed: real proof, real clarity, and a son who is safe, free, and finally able to build a life with someone who wants him for who he is, not for what his father is quietly worth. If you made it this far, you already know this story was never really about the money. It was about paying attention. If this one meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe for more real family stories, and tell me down in the comments, son or daughter, what you would have done in my place. I'll see you in the next one.